I was hoping I wouldn't have to follow my dear friend. I've done this quite a few times, and it never plays in my favor. But I thought I would begin by saying welcome back to about half of you here. This is a very familiar looking group because we just did the session on Beyond the Pale, a very important and valuable new book co-edited by Stacy Floyd Thomas and Miguel de la Torre. And about half of you were there for that, so welcome back. The issue was the future of liberation theology, and in a way it is here as well. I've long admired and been grateful for Mark Ellis's work in conceiving a prophetic Jewish theology and for his prophetic social criticism. 30 years ago, I was a pastor to a congregation of Episcopalians who let me drag them into the sanctuary movement, the nuclear freeze movement, and then the anti-apartheid movement. Since we were an urban congregation, I suggested that perhaps we could also do urban ministry. But that didn't go as well. If we were going to do idealistic things, we had to do them in ways that didn't upset the middle-class, waspy ethos of my congregation. So I founded a study group, and one of the first books that we read was Mark's book on his experience at the Catholic Worker in New York. This evocative book of poems and diary entries did not break us free of middle-class religion, but it did introduce me to Mark. I had no religious background, and I was involved in social justice organizing for years before I joined a church. It was an odd experience to be serving as a pastor when I had no experience whatsoever of being a church member. Mark impressed me as somebody who was similarly trying to figure out his religious identity and trying to live out his social justice commitments within it, and who was willing to cross religious boundaries to do so. At some point I learned that he had joined the faculty at Maryknoll. We never met, but we had friends in common, and we both wrote for Orbis books. I was determined not to be an academic, but that didn't work out. And by the late 1980s, I was teaching liberation theology to college students. One of my staple texts was Mark's book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. It was important to me to persuade my students that liberation theology was not an exclusively Christian enterprise. Although for years, the only evidence that I produced for this thesis was Mark's book. When you're young, a young academic and scholar, you only know this much, and you try to get as much mileage as you can out of what you know. The first and second editions of Mark's book were published in 1987 and 1989. If you compare the first two editions to the third edition of 2004, the differences are striking. The scholarly basis of the third edition is deeper and wider. It shows the extraordinary wealth of experience and learning that were packed into his 15 years at Maryknoll and his extensive travels. The chapters in the third edition build on each other more successfully, they develop a sustained argument, and the prose is more supple and stylish. This edition also benefited from the material that he folded into it from his book published in 1990, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power. And yet, the first edition, with all its youthful stretching, already had fully the things that matter most in Mark's work. A passionate determined to discern and live out the social justice core of prophetic religion, an explicitly liberationist method and message, and his wrestling with what he called there the Holocaust theologies of Elie Wiesel, Richard Rubenstein, Emil Fackenheim, and Irving Greenberg, plus in that book, The Witness of Martin Buber. Although the third edition incorporated parts of Mark's book, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, don't let that dissuade you from reading the latter book if you haven't read it, because there are jewels in it that didn't get recycled. One of them is especially unsettling for me. Mark's discussion of Reinhold Niebuhr's sweeping denigration of Arab society and culture. Niebuhr commendably argued that the Jewish people had a right to survive as a people in a resurrected nation. He was an advocate of a binational Palestine. But in 1942 and 46, he aggressively contended that the Palestinians were threatening, backward, ignorant, and totally lacking in cultural achievements. The Arab masses as a whole, he assured, were so poor and backward that holding an opinion, quote, is an impossible luxury for them. In his telling, there was only one conceivable vehicle of progress in the entire Arab world: the Western civilization brought by European Jews. This argument perpetuated and legitimized a baleful tradition of denigration for which we're still paying. Edmund Wilson, at the time, was another proponent of it. Mark has spent a good deal of his work inveighing against this prejudice wherever he finds it, and as he acknowledges in his new book, Encountering the Jewish Future, one can find it in the writings of his intellectual heroes, especially Emmanuel Levinas, who was blatant in dreading people from the two-thirds world. Mark's engagements in this book with Wiesel, Rubinstein, Buber, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Hannah Arendt, and Levinas are probing, insightful, and often conflicted. Generational experience cannot be replicated, even if one is determined to try. And Mark is always working through to get beyond the experience of the Holocaust generation. One engagement in this book, the one that frames all the others, struck me especially. It is Mark's triangular conversation with Wiesel and Rubinstein. Wiesel, the survivor and storyteller, the icon of the Holocaust, buries Israel's God of history with a literary, spiraling, unforgettable litany of "Never shall I forget." Never would he forget the moments that murdered his God in his soul, even if he were condemned to live as long as God himself, which makes this never a statement about struggling to be Jewish after his first day at Auschwitz. As Mark says, this litany, rather than letting go of God, construes Jewish existence in and after Auschwitz as a challenge to sustain a difficult life with the God of Israel, who stays in the picture, despite having been so undeniably absent at Auschwitz.